Just before 2:50 p.m., this is the viewpoint seen by many of the 26,000 marathon runners who are approaching the finish line.
Terror on the streets of London, blood on the pavement, an attack in broad daylight outside Woolwich Army Barracks.
You people will never be safe. Remove your governments, they don't care about you.
Terror in the heart of Paris.
It is extremely ambitious. It is not simply interested in carving out a little mini state. It's now calling it a caliphate, straddling the border between Iraq and Syria. It has global ambitions.
Here you've got ISIS, which is a terrorist organization controlling a state. It has oil, it has money, it has territory, it has weapons.
Striking from the air, the U.S. and its allies stepping up the fight against ISIS, pounding targets across Iraq and Syria with growing ferocity.
ISIL is not Islamic. No religion condones the killing of innocents, and the vast majority of ISIL's victims have been Muslim. And ISIL is certainly not a state.
The cold-hearted masked man with the British accent is Mohammed Emwazi, a Briton from a well-to-do family who grew up in London and graduated from college with a degree in computer programming.
It's clearly a fight between good and evil. I think it's a generational fight. As I said actually to President Putin, I think this is a third world war by other means.
A deadly terror attack at an American company in France. At least one person dead, several injured at the gas factory.
Well, that's a tough act to follow. That is the topic today, terrorism. I have a bit of a moderator's dilemma here. We have 25 minutes, and I have biographies of these three people that could take me 25 minutes to give you. So Richard Haass is the president of the Council on Foreign Relations. He's also served Director of Policy Planning in the State Department under one President Bush and in the NSC of another President Bush. Farah Pandit has served 3 administrations, most recently as the Special Envoy to Muslim Communities, and Nick Burns is also, I should say, Farah is a fellow at Harvard and the Council. And then Nick is the director of the Aspen Institute Aspen Strategy Group. Yeah, yes, Walter will be after me. And also professor at Harvard, also was at the State Department under George Bush, as well as ambassador to NATO and to Greece. Okay, so we've done that. I want to start with a classification exercise. Richard, I'll start with you. When we hear about terror and the threat from terrorism, what is it? Are we talking about ISIS? Are we talking about al-Qaeda? Which is the greater strategic threat? Or are they a combined threat in just different ways?
When we speak about terror in general, we're talking about the use of violence, often deadly violence, in the pursuit of a political cause. ISIS and al-Qaeda are related, but there are distinctions with differences. I think the biggest difference is that al-Qaeda is more of an organization, and its agenda, at least up to now, has been mostly destructive. It's been a blower-upper, and at times quite an effective one. I actually think ISIS is something different and much more problematic. It has, if you will, a positive agenda. By that it means, in its own image, it wants to create as well as destroy. It's organizational, but it's also networky and movementy, and it also has many of the features of a nation state. And the fact that it calls itself not ISIL, not ISIS, but it calls itself the Islamic State is a message people should heed. When it changed its nomenclature, it was essentially sending the message, we do not consider ourselves geographically defined or bound. We have a larger set of objectives, and whether it's the Islamic State or the Caliphate, we should take that seriously. They have, if you will, a very broad agenda that they are determined to realize.
Farah, that agenda is, some people that I've talked to have said, well, that agenda is within its own state. They're not worried about the United States, whereas al-Qaeda was worried about big, dramatic attacks to knock the West down. respond to that classification. Is that the right way to think about it?
So I look at the threat as extremist ideology, period. Right now we're looking at ISIS. There's something else that's going to come after ISIS. As we think about the extremist ideology, it's a global threat, so we've got to be really concerned about that. It's not just what's happening in a particular region, Northern Africa, Middle East. It's not containable. And we're looking at a demographic that is gigantic. 1.6 billion Muslims on the planet. That's 1/4 of humanity. 62% of that number is under the age of 30. That is the demographic from which the bad guys recruit. So when I look at the threat that we are facing, right now there are obviously physical barriers, an ISIS, an AQ, a Boko Haram, an Al-Shabaab, but there's a larger question about the ideology that we're confronting and how we must understand that for the threat at home and certainly the impact on our globe.
Yeah, is this a threat that can be attacked with drones in one instance with Al-Qaeda, but with better, social media with ISIS? Or how do you look at the threat from the way we address it and the tools we use to address those two threats?
Well, first, John, it's a profound threat. We see now the threat of both Al-Qaeda and the Islamic State in the Arab world and the Middle East, in East Africa, and in the Sahelian belt of North Africa, all the way to Mauritania on the west coast of Africa. But we also see it, and Farah's been talking about this a lot, we see it in Paris. Right. We see it in the streets of our own country. So we can't take for granted that somehow this is far away, it's not going to come home. That's the first point. I think to answer your question, after 9/11, Colin Powell, and Richard and I both worked for Secretary Powell, came out to Brussels where I was ambassador. He addressed the EU and he said, we're not going to win the fight against the old Al-Qaeda, Osama bin Laden's, by military means alone. We've got to have good intelligence, good judicial cooperation, dry up the sources of their financing, political cooperation. He said the military is probably the last leg of what you do to defeat them, and that's how I look at the Islamic State and Al-Qaeda. Long-term effort that we're going to have to sustain over several administrations. We're going to have to lead this because we're the great creator of coalitions in the world. But I think, as Richard said, the threat from the Islamic State is really considerable if you think about this. They have a name. They have a state. They control 1/3 of Syria and 1/3 of Iraq. They have a charismatic leader. They have a cause. They're recruiting over 10,000 fighters. They have a revenue stream. Yeah. And we have a policy in place to try to contain it. We don't have a policy in place to defeat it.
But we say our policy is to defeat it, right?
And we don't have a policy to defeat it in place because you cannot defeat the Islamic State through air power. You have to have a ground force. I think the president's made the right decision not to reinsert 100,000 American combat troops into Iraq or Syria, but we're going to have to help the Arabs constitute, the Iraqi army, Syrian rebels, some kind of fighting force if we want to make inroads against the base of Al-Qaeda in northern Syria.
Richard, what's your thought about containment of ISIS or stamping out of ISIS?
Well, stamping it out is unrealistic. And I'm a great believer that you ought not to espouse policy goals that you're setting yourselves up to failure. You're not going to eliminate it. This is part of the new normal. This is just part of the fabric now of international relations. And even if you're phenomenally successful, John, and you get rid of 99.99% of the people Farah was just talking about, there's still thousands of people out there who are going to be attracted to this sort of thing. So eliminating it is silly. What you want to do is put it on the defensive as much as you can. You want to limit its access to human, material, other forms of resources. You want to deal with it in different time horizons, the immediate, the medium term, the long term. But you're going to need a policy, as Nick suggested, with virtually the entire toolkit. And then I think you have to look at what do you do to push it back? What do you do to reduce the vulnerability of those whom it might attack? I would say, for example, at the top of the list, we ought to be thinking about is Saudi Arabia. If you're a group and you call yourself the Islamic State, there's no way you're going to be satisfied if another country happens to be an Islamic State that oversees Mecca and Medina. It's a question of when and not if this outfit trains its guns, literally and figuratively, on Saudi Arabia. So we need to think about how do we reduce the vulnerability, Jordan, Saudi Arabia, potential targets. How do we get the Turks, rather than being enablers, to becoming part of the real effort against them, to slow down dramatically the flow of recruits? And then how do we militarily, among other things, attack them in Iraq? And the only thing I disagree with Nick is I don't think the Iraqi government's a serious partner. I would work directly with Kurds and the Sunni tribes in the West. And I think the biggest intellectual conundrum at this point is what do we do about Syria? We've allowed things to deteriorate in Syria to the point where there is no available ground partner. Nick's 100% right. You can't win this from the air. So then the question is, how do we get from where we are to where we have a viable ground partner? That, to me, is the biggest challenge, but also the biggest necessity in Syria.
Farah, let me ask you a question about what I hear about from local law enforcement in the United States and the FBI, which is they feel like they're being just overrun by messages in chat rooms and Twitter that are radicalizing people to go into malls. And when I talk to voters on the campaign trail, when you ask them about terrorism, one man I talked to said, well, you know, I'm worried about, and he named a major department store. Yep. And his argument was because there are too many doors in there, and that means it's not safe. How do you combat an idea that is coming over social media? We're talking about Syria, and you can talk about Syria and Yemen and Iraq, but how do you combat an idea?
So I want to say a couple of things. One is our country needs to go all in. Nick is correct. If we're going to go after this, we have to go all in. To me, that means scaling up things that we already know and what works on the ground. It means understanding the millennial mind. It means using hard and what quote-unquote soft power in an integrated way for a strategy to go forward. And it means unleashing the power of the counter-narratives that are out there. So that goes to your question, John. What works? What is going to work? Well, certainly we understand no country on earth has the credibility to push upon a millennial and tell them what to do. It isn't going to work. Who do young kids talk to? Who do they understand? Their peers. What we have to do is scale up the credible voices all over the world that are nuanced and very organic and small, and move them into the mainstream. So when you talk about this person that you spoke to in the middle of America who's concerned about the mall in America, the kids in America that are vulnerable, the 3 girls in Denver who are getting on a plane to go to fight for Syria, you might ask, well, first of all, wow, girls are getting recruited, and then B, what's so appealing about Syria? They're living in a beautiful state of Colorado. Why do they need to go anywhere else? There is something that is happening to Muslim millennials that we have to understand, and that crisis of identity is at the core of what is happening. So what we need to do is to find those people that make sense for those young kids to fill the marketplace with the counter-narratives that appeal to them, not just a one-off, tell them about democracy, don't tell them about freedom and everything will be fine, but get these kids to understand who in their neighborhoods can speak to them in ways that will matter. To the point about the domestic threat that we face, what you hear a lot is that we only have 180 Americans who tried to make their way to Syria. It is something that's happening over there. You talked about something very important, and that is the ideology that is spread globally. With the swish of a finger, millennial is connecting ideas between Denver, Kuala Lumpur, Oslo, and Nouakchott, Mauritania. They are not waiting for someone to say, here is a script and you must follow it. They're ricocheting these ideas around the world. You've got to blast the marketplace with these counter-narratives online, and the way to do that is for non-government actors to be able to do this, and this is where we have failed.
How in the world do you do that? How do you get non-governmental actors? I mean, what Farah's talking about sounds correct, but fuzzy. I mean, in other words, you can either send troops or not send troops to somewhere. You can, and in the context of the way it's discussed politically, it's often those big kinetic moments. But how do you do something that's a little bit softer like that?
I think it gets to the really complex way that we have to carry out diplomacy in the 21st century. I became a diplomat as an intern in 1980 in the heart of the Cold War. It was pretty much a East-West bloc, traditional diplomacy behind closed doors. 35 years later, everything's transparent. The NGOs, and most of them are virtuous, these non-state actors, most virtuous, taking up a huge space. We see it on climate change. We see it in this space. So what government needs to do is align itself with the NGO community, the indigenous civil societies in Iraq, in Syria, in Tunisia, in Libya, and work with them. It's not impossible to do, but it just takes a more creative mindset about what you think diplomacy is. I wanted to say a word about Syria. If you think about the fact that the Middle East is in a revolutionary spiral of violence, and that Libya has ceased to be a nation state, Yemen divided in civil war, Iraq split into 3 parts. Syria is the country where I think your question comes into play. How do we bring the private sector and the nonprofit world in? 260,000 people dead, 11 million of the 22.4 million Syrians now homeless. That there's no state in the world where half the citizens are homeless. And so what I think the Obama administration needs to do, and we are the only country that can pull together this coalition, is work very closely with the refugee NGOs to get refugee assistance into the internally displaced as well as the refugees outside the country. We have not done a good enough job. We're going to have to bite the bullet, I think, and reconstitute a big diplomatic discussion with the Russians and the Iranians in order to allow that refugee assistance in. Right now it's being blocked by the Russians and Chinese in the Security Council. But it's going to have to be a partnership between the International Rescue Committee and other refugee organizations, the U.S. government, and the UN, the Gates Foundation, actually to save a population. Those refugee numbers, 11 million, is going to climb to 12, 13, 14 million, unless we do something to break the impasse. And so that's a concrete example where governments and nonprofits come together.
Because if that isn't done, obviously you'll have the humanitarian problem, but what will happen if you don't do that? How is that connected to terror?
I actually think, well, in the case of Syria, I think the refugee issue is going to have to move the Obama administration sometime this year to do something different with Russia and the Iranians, begin talking about the future of Syria without Bashar al-Assad. You know, we don't want to actually see him fall and have the Islamic State replace him. We don't want to see him continue in power. The only countries that can help work out some kind of very rough, violent transition to someone else are Russia and Iran. And right now, we haven't been ready to do that. But it is interesting when President Putin and President Obama talked last week, when the Kremlin and White House did the readout to the press, what was the call about? They said, Kerry and Lavrov, the two foreign ministers, will talk about Syria. I think we have to do that with the Russians.
Richard, let me, in our remaining time, pivot a little bit. We're going to have an election. It's going on already. Help us, since that's one way in which this discussion takes place, the terrorism discussion, help us think about how to separate serious candidates from those who aren't serious about this issue. How will you know if they're serious? I mean, in other words, if they're just saying terrorism's all about forward spotters, do they have it all in forward spotters in Iraq? Do they have it right? I mean, how do we know?
Well, a shorthand would be anyone who talks about solving the problem, they're probably not on the serious problem side. This is not a problem to be solved. If we're lucky, it's a condition to be managed. Second of all, anyone who thinks that the answer is simply with one tool, this military tool, forward spotters, this is not a single tool approach. It's different time horizons, different tools, different localities. It's that complex. So someone who I think appreciates the complexity. And then lastly, the trade-offs. There's going to be some tough things. Nick just mentioned what I think is a big idea, and it happens to be one I'm pretty comfortable with, which is we've got to move to a post-Assad government. We don't have the leverage to do it ourselves. That means diplomacy, and that means getting into bed diplomatically with two actors we don't particularly much like, Russia and Iran, because they happen to have the most influence in Damascus. Okay, let's begin that process, because what's the alternative? We can do all we want on the refugee side, but that won't help the geopolitics. And if we talk about building up a counter-government bunch of Syrians, everyone in this room is going to have a lot more grandchildren before we get to that point. We need a near-term strategy. So we have got to be serious about trying diplomacy. So the only candidates who I think are worth listening to this are people who reflect that degree of complexity, and it begins with an analysis of just how tough this is, how consequential it is, and then you look at the array of tools and the trade-offs.
There is a competition among some to see who can talk about how much tougher they can be on Putin, which seems to be directly against what you're saying.
Well, again, on Putin, and I think it's actually a larger diplomatic point. I don't think we have the luxury anymore in this day and age for all or nothing, one-dimensional diplomacy. Well, we disagree with Mr. Putin over Ukraine, so we're going to put him in the penalty box on everything else. Or we're focusing on the nuclear talks with Iran. We're not going to deal with them on either Syria or with the Taliban in Afghanistan. Or we disagree with China on one thing, therefore we're not going to deal with anything else. We don't have the luxury of that kind of a linkage diplomacy. We're going to actually have to have an approach to diplomacy that's much more compartmentalized. And we're going to have to be willing on Mondays, Wednesdays, and Fridays to work with certain actors who we may find somewhat odious on certain issues where we actually happen to have an overlap. And we'll continue to oppose them on other days of the week on other issues. We're going to have to learn to do that.
Farah. The same question to you, but I want to expand it to where Richard's taken it, which is not only how do you tell when a candidate's serious, but what does the electorate need to know about the state of terrorism in the world right now? In other words, to not have a false set of expectations about what's possible in the world today.
Sure. One thing I did want to just say about the refugees, let's not forget that they're getting radicalized. The bad guys are already in the refugee camps doing all kinds of damage. So I want to make sure that people understand that. And that the pictures taken from the refugees are used as a recruitment tool as well. On the candidates, I would say three things. One is a candidate that does not, as Richard said, understand that there are many tools in the toolbox is a failure in my view on this issue. Will not be able to address the needs that we're facing. How does that happen? I think, first of all, as I said to you before, and I want to just go over once again, a candidate needs to understand that this is a long-term global threat, and I don't just mean when it is convenient for them to say it's a global talking point, but that they institute in the way in which they're conducting policy the connectivity of this ideology globally. That means new money to the table. That means reshaping how our diplomats are doing work in our embassies around the world. Thirdly, that they understand absolutely that the millennial mind is what we have to understand. And we have a vast group of failures around that. Okay? What is happening to the adolescent mind is what we have to unpack so that we can have innovative solutions to the table. So the candidate that is able to think more strategically about how we think about this threat, combines hard and soft power, as I said, sees it globally, and finally goes all in. And one of the things we haven't said that must be done in order for ISIS to defeat its brand is we have to defeat ISIS's ability to say they are succeeding. And that must happen. Part of the reason that they are winning is because they're saying we won, we won, we won, and they're gaining recruits because they're gaining land. So the candidate has to have that piece of it involved. Second, please.
Can I just jump in? How do you do that? Say, no, you're not winning? I mean, or
no,
do you...
but so we have to defeat them in some places.
No, ISIS is a momentum play. And we've got to break the momentum. I think the best place to break the momentum in the near term is Iraq. And I would focus on the Kurds and the Sunni tribes. They're the most capable actors. If we can break the momentum, the recruiting will begin to slow. Exactly. It is essential to change. They can't have an aura of inevitability about them, or that will become self-fulfilling. We have got to break that.
And then to your point about what the American constituency who's voting for the next president needs to understand. The way in which we have to look at this is not just in terms of the threat for our homeland, which is another conversation in a different panel, but we have to look beyond that because it's what you said, what do you want your great-grandkids to be dealing with? There are far more issues in this world. This issue of this ideology is containable. The solutions are available and affordable. So what you want is the American public to push pressure on the candidates to be able to granularize the way in which they're going to approach this and not just say big statements about how much they care about terrorism. Show me the money at the end of the day.
Right. Okay. So the same pair of questions to you about seriousness of a candidate and then also what the public has to be conditioned for in this new conversation because, you know, since the Iraq war, it's very difficult to have a public conversation in the political context. Everybody's terrified about looking like they were in support of the Iraq war or any parts of its elements, or a conversation in which you say we must go engage in countries because if we don't engage with them over there, they're going to be coming and engaging in the United States. So I'll throw that in as an added bit of complexity to this now four-part question.
Well, I hope we have two candidates who finally run the general election who will have two seemingly opposite characteristics. One, we need leadership. And second, we need some humility. And we need to understand also sometimes the value of restraint. And they're not mutually contradictory. We are as Bill Clinton said 20 years ago, we're the indispensable country. We're still the indispensable country. China cannot play this organizing role that we've been talking about and is not inclined to in the Middle East. Russia's discredited. Iran is thoroughly discredited in the Sunni world. Like it or not, the coalition builder in the fight against ISIS, Al-Qaeda, and all the things that the three of us have talked about is going to have to be the United States. Right now you have chaos. You have Qatar, Turkey, and Saudi Arabia supporting different rebel groups in Syria. We're not even in the game. So we need strong American leadership. These are our friends. We have some influence over these countries. We should create a big tent. We should devise with them the strategy and make sure that they're with us and not, funding and supporting groups that are antithetical to us. That's leadership, and it combines as Richard and I were talking about, going after ISIS through air power, but also being bold diplomatically, engaging Putin and engaging the Iranians on the future of Syria. The opposite side of it is, and here's where I have a lot of admiration for President Obama, we have to be a little bit humble about our belief that we can somehow resolve these problems in the short term. This is a 20 to 30 to 40-year fight and struggle, much like the Cold War struggle was for our generation when we were a little bit younger. And I think what President Obama has done very well is to say, we can't be in every fight,
Right.
and there are times when we have to be restrained in what we do. We have to pick and choose where we can actually make a difference. I think the fight against the Islamic State is one of those fights. Those seem to be opposite characteristics, but I think our president needs to be sophisticated, be able to hold together complex thoughts that seemingly are opposite, and be able to lead. And I think there are a couple of candidates. I'll just name two. I think Hillary Clinton and Jeb Bush are those types of people. I hope they rise to get through the primaries and run against each other, and we have a healthy debate on these issues.
Well, as a final question to all of you, pick up on something Nick said, Richard, which is, well, there are a couple of things you said that interest me. One, when I talk to people in the administration about this idea of restraint, it's often in that same sentence they talk about free riders. And their argument is, you know, we can't solve all these problems in the world. So that seems to undermine your leadership point, which is, and I know you're saying there's some cases you need to lead and some you need to be restrained. But I guess the question is, if we are restrained, then you hear a lot of diplomats in other countries say, well, the United States is withdrawing, it's not leading, we don't have a strong United States, so we have to take on, we have to do things now on our own because of the United States. So why don't you address that, and then I'll ask the two of them. This notion of the United States in retreat.
I think the problem that the administration has right now, in part because we've not been wholly in the fight against the Islamic State, in part because President Obama drew a red line in 2013 in front of Assad, and when he crossed it, we didn't respond. There's a belief that we're disengaging from our traditional friends and allies, Israel, the Gulf states, Saudi Arabia. So as the Iran nuclear deal goes forward, we talked about this in the tent this morning, the president's going to have to close the gap with Prime Minister Netanyahu and begin to work with him again. And that's a mutual exercise. It's not all on the president. He's already started that with the Camp David summit with the Arab leaders, but only 2 of the 4 heads of government showed up. And so he's going to have to do a lot of work diplomatically to remake the American coalition that really Jimmy Carter put together, that every president since then has put together. We're the primary Middle East power.
Yeah.
And we're the ones that hold these coalitions together. We haven't been acting like that.
Richard, talk briefly here at the end about this notion of restraint, but then also still being the leader.
Well, restraint is neither always right nor always wrong. Even Churchill said appeasement can be the best policy at times, it can be the worst policy at times. Restraint, to me, was a mistake in Syria several years ago. I think it was the most consequential mistake of Mr. Obama's presidency. I wish he had had more restraint when it came to Libya. I think we actually would have been well served by restraint rather than intervening there. I wish we had had more restraint from Mr. Bush when it came to Iraq in 2003. I wish we had less restraint from Mr. Obama when it came to pulling all U.S. troops out of Iraq. So you can't set up, again, restraint is neither good nor bad. What I think you've all got to think in all these cases, what are the consequences of acting, not acting? What is it you're likely to set in motion? And what you should learn from these things, I think, are local realities. We may sit in Washington with all sorts of geopolitical abstractions, but at some point, foreign policy has to get local. And that ought to have been the lesson of Vietnam. We forgot it. It ought to have been the lesson of Iraq. We seem to have forgotten it. But when we come up in the Middle East, we've got to be really 2020 about what are the local realities, what amount of what kind of U.S. policy is likely to have what effect. And so in some cases it may argue for restraint. In other cases it may argue for boldness. You've just got to, in each case, look at the details of the specific situation and then forge your approach.
Last point, Carl.
And I'll make it really quickly. From my vantage point, the greatest strength of the United States government is to be the convener and the facilitator and the intellectual partner with the ideas that we hear on the ground. There are photo ops that happen. There are announcements being made about all kinds of meetings. We have to do all of that, but things can happen behind the scenes. When I think about leading, it's also leading in a way that everybody doesn't see all day, every day, but it catalyzes the kind of movements that we need to see happen. And we've done it before, and we can do it again.
Thank you all very much.
mic around.
And I'll just pull on it just to get the material down the top. Thank you so much for giving me this.
Yes? Thanks. Great, thank you. I think questions from the crowd will be great. So maybe we'll see, like, Thank you so much. I'm Rainey Aronson, the executive producer of Frontline, the investigative series on PBS. I'm so excited to be here today. Of course, Frontline has a great depth of knowledge and also publishing on terrorism for years. Pre-9/11, but certainly in the last number of years, we've been looking closely at ISIS. We've had actual 4 big efforts around ISIS, starting when they started to emerge out of Syria, and we started to try to understand who ISIS is and what do they stand for. I'm so excited to have these guys on the panel today. In fact, we're researching and developing a film exactly on this subject. So this is producing an action. This will be wonderful to hear what they have to say. I think the first thing I'm hoping is that you can each introduce yourselves and answer this question, which is one of the most complicated questions, but try to keep it brief. How Muslim is ISIS? And I think that will set the stage for the variety of points of view here, and one of the most important questions that I think we can ask about ISIS. So let's start, sir.
You want me to start?
Yeah.
Okay. So get right into that controversial issue.
Well, no, tell us who you are.
Okay. Yeah, sure. My name is Shadi Hamid. I'm a fellow at the Brookings Institution. I do a lot of work on Islamist movements and the role of Islam in politics more generally. And I've spent really since, I guess, 2004, I've been spending a lot of time with Muslim Brotherhood activists and leaders throughout the region, trying to understand who are these people that we call Islamists, what animates them, what do they believe in, and pardon the book plug, but my recent book, which is called Temptations of Power, deals with a lot of those issues and trying to understand how Islamists evolve over time.
Yeah, I think the real question we're trying to ask today is how Muslim is ISIS?
Yeah, so,
it's complicated, but just in a couple of
sure.
moments,
Just
explain.
So very quickly on that, I'm not a big fan of this whole kind of politically correct thing of ISIS has nothing to do with Islam. That's what a lot of my Muslim friends and colleagues, that's what they say, and I understand where they're coming from. But I feel like when you say that to an American audience, they're like, wait, what's going on here? We see this group called ISIS. They very clearly think that what they're doing is Islamic. So when we say, well, ISIS has nothing to do with Islam, it sounds detached from reality. So what we can say, I think, is that the overwhelming majority of Muslims abhor ISIS's ideology. So the polling that we have anecdotally, that seems to be pretty clear. But ISIS, the people who actually fight for the movement, they believe that what they're doing is right. They believe that what they're doing is true to the Prophet's model. We don't have to like it, but I think that when we're talking about religious actors, we have to take their beliefs seriously. We can't say, well, they don't really mean what they say, or ISIS are really just Baathists in disguise. No, let's take them seriously. If they keep on insisting to us, and if we look at pretty much all the primary source documents in Arabic, they very self-consciously are trying to kind of go back to what they consider is the kind of original essence in a very strict, uncompromising, vicious, brutal way, but they believe it.
Great.
Thank you. So my name is Maajid Nawaz. I am founding chairman of Quilliam, which we like to dub as the world's first counter-extremism think tank. Our role is to be a Muslim-led organization founded by former Islamists to tackle the Islamist ideology through civic engagement, debate, critical engagement, writing, and so on and so forth. We try and amplify our voices through various media, and crucially what we're attempting to do is, what you heard on the previous panel, is help with some of those counter-narratives and also help essentially in encouraging a reform discourse to emerge from within Islamic discourse. How I got to do that is I spent 13 years on the leadership of an Islamist group. 5 of them were in prison in Egypt as a political prisoner, adopted by Amnesty International as a prisoner of conscience under Hosni Mubarak. Interestingly, the cell he held me in eventually housed him and the interior minister who housed us as well. Mazra' Tora prison in Cairo. But you can hear more about that in my talk tomorrow morning at 8 o'clock. To the question about how Islamic is ISIS. I remember one of the things that pushed me away initially from the Islamist ideology. And you know, when I use the phrase Islamist ideology, just to be very clear so there's no confusion, I'm not talking about Islamic faith. What I mean is a desire to impose any version of that faith over society. And when it's violent, I call it jihadism. These are distinct terms that I use in this meaning. You may have your own phrases. It's just what I mean when I use these terms. And I don't mean Islam and jihad. They're two other terms. They are also distinct. They have their own meanings as well. But when I say, for the purpose of this discussion, Islamism, I'm referring to the desire to impose a version of my own religion over society. And one of the conversations I remember having in prison that turned me off this Islamist ideology was a very detailed conversation with some of the forebearers of ISIS, discussing with me the detailed jurisprudence of how to enslave women. And this really leads to this point as to how Islamic is ISIS. We have this saying, there's no, you know, we have, I don't know if you have it in America, but in English we have, you know, because we obviously speak English and you speak American, but we have this saying called the no true Scotsman fallacy, which if you may have heard, you know, this whole idea as to who's really a Scotsman, who's really a Marxist. Kalakowski was addressing this in essence as well, to address this question as to what's the true Marxist. And the question presupposes that truth lies in that very doctrine that you're trying to answer in the first place. What is the true Muslim presupposes that there is the definition of a true Muslim and a correct form of Islam, which presupposes belief. And that's the problem here, that most of you don't have that belief system in the first place. So the question is redundant. I think what Shadi said is correct. They consider themselves Islamic, and that's all really that matters in answering this question. I think it's incorrect to say they've got nothing to do with Islam. It's also incorrect to say they have everything to do with Islam. The truth is, they have something to do with Islam. What is that something? That something is that they justify their own vehemently repugnant ideas by using Islamic scripture. Now, that's important for us to know, because when we're engaged in counter-narratives, when we're engaged in psyops against them, when we're in fact engaged in encouraging other religious Muslims to challenge them, it's important to know how they justify their own views from Scripture and where the weaknesses are in that scriptural reasoning. But let's not be fooled. It is a scriptural reasoning that they're employing. And you know, I fear sometimes in this debate, because we want to be polite and we don't want to be seen to be racist, and we want to be politically correct and all of those things, which are important in their own right, I fear sometimes we succumb to what I've come to call of late the Voldemort effect. And you know, those of you who haven't read Harry Potter may not know what I'm speaking about. I read all seven Harry Potter books in prison, in Mazra' Tora, which I told J.K. Rowling on occasion when I had dinner with her. And she was shocked. But the truth is, I read all of them. And actually, what the bad guy, the evil guy in these Harry Potter books is called Voldemort. Now, everyone is so petrified of mentioning his name that two things happen. One is that they deny he even exists. And two, those who do want to acknowledge he exists are told do not name him, but rather refer to him as he who must not be named. Now, these two problems, I think, we've fallen for this effect when it comes to looking at the Islamist ideology. The previous panel also correctly said, I think it was Farah Pandith who said, that ISIS is merely the latest manifestation of this. There is going to be something after ISIS, and there were many, many such groups before ISIS. And this is the problem I have with focusing our attention just on ISIS. That if we cannot understand there's an ideology beyond this and behind this, and if we're too scared to name that ideology, we succumb to that Voldemort effect. What it does is it increases the hysteria. Because if we cannot isolate this ideology from the traditional faith of Islam, then the average, ordinary, everyday person who isn't well learned in all of this debate may think every Muslim supports ISIS. And in fact, the surveys and the various polling indicates the opposite. So we have to have this open conversation, even if it's uncomfortable, even if my own community feels instinctively defensive, even if sometimes people get offended. But listen, people were offended at the idea of the female vote when it was first floated as an idea. That doesn't mean we don't have the conversation. So I think I'll stop there.
Thank you. I was discussing with the panelists earlier that just this morning we're working on a film called Escaping ISIS, which is looking at how ISIS has actually captured many of the Yazidi. And one of the things that we were able to find is some footage that was captured that's undercover that really has them talking about their feelings about Yazidi women, in particular, their ability to enslave and also the ability to marry women, girls, at the very young age of 9. So a lot of the footage that's starting to emerge, not the propaganda footage that they're putting out themselves, is using this type of ideology inside their own conversations. The unedited version of what they're saying inside their own community is something that we're going to be exploring in our upcoming Frontline. Graham, you had a really influential, provocative piece. In fact, it was required reading at Frontline. We had it on every single desk of every editorial person. One of the interesting things is we pulled all the response to Graham's piece, and it was massive. And I said I would hand it over to him because it has really started an important conversation. Tell us a bit who you are, but also I know you wrote this incredibly long piece, so if you can just briefly. When you come at the other end of writing something like that, with the amount of response you've gotten, have you changed your mind at all? Would you have asked different questions?
So taking the last question first, I referred to an area of Philadelphia as a dangerous area. Apparently it's fully gentrified by now, so I would change that aspect of the piece. Most of the rest of it, though, I would keep roughly as it was. So yes, my name is Graham Wood. I am a writer for The Atlantic. I've written there since 2006 and have been going back to Iraq off and on since 2003. The piece that you're referring to is one that I started in the middle of last year. And it was sparked in part by the question of what does ISIS really want, and what can we find out just by talking to supporters of ISIS and asking them what motivates you? What are the things that you think that this organization is able to accomplish that you care about? And I sort of joined Shadi in being a bit annoyed that this question, how Islamic is ISIS, is one that we have to talk about. And so I blame the President of the United States for so clearly taking one position on this. And as a result of that, we're having this discussion now. To say that ISIS has nothing to do with Islam, that it's not Islamic, my response to that, conditioned of course by these interviews with supporters of ISIS, was that even the barest examination of the documents that exist from within ISIS and from conversations with its supporters, you have to acknowledge that yes, they believe that they are following Islam. And when they justify both to themselves and to the rest of the world what they're doing, they are drawing from this diverse tradition of Islam. Now, it's a diverse, and I hasten to add, a contradictory tradition. There's many different Islams. And there are many different ways that one can be a Muslim. Now, ISIS has a very minoritarian view of Islam. They believe that they're Muslims and that most people who call themselves Muslims are not. So
that's an important distinction, what you just said, and I hope you can talk a bit about that, Dahlia, because that's important. Yes.
I'll say one last thing about this question. Among the four of us right here, I'm in some ways at a loss, because as a non-Muslim, there are two aspects of the question of whether ISIS is Islamic. One is a question that I think Muslims alone decide, whether ISIS is properly Muslim, whether they follow the right kind of Islam. And then the second question, of course, is do they derive inspiration from, again, this diverse 1,000-odd year tradition of Islam? That question is one that non-Muslims can answer. And the question of whether they derive inspiration from Muslim texts, clearly the answer is yes. Just as Messianic settlers in Israel would derive inspiration from Jewish texts, and would we say that they are not Jewish just because they're from a very minoritarian view of what Judaism is? Absolutely not.
Dahlia, I loved your book, and we had just talked before the panel. Are you going to be writing, first of all, tell them about your book. Also, will you be writing a new book because it published in 2008 and the world has indeed changed? So tell us a bit about yourself.
Okay, great, thank you. My name is Dahlia Mogahid, and I direct research at the Institute for Social Policy and Understanding. I was formerly with the Gallup organization, where I led research on Muslims around the world. I wrote a book with John Esposito called Who Speaks for Islam? What a Billion Muslims Really Think. And it was an attempt to in a scientific way, give ordinary people a voice. So there is the outcome of hundreds of thousands of interviews from more than 40 countries, representative Gallup polls, asking ordinary people about their views on lots of things, from women's rights to democracy to violent extremism. So the question of how Islamic is ISIS or how Muslim is ISIS is actually a little bit of a trick question. So I'm going to step back a bit and explain what I mean. If the question is, do they claim to be, or do they actually sincerely in their hearts derive inspiration from Islamic texts to justify their brutality? The answer is, of course, yes. I mean, that's kind of an obvious point. But I want to answer a slightly different question, which is, if Islam did not exist, so if we just, imagine this for a moment, would a group like ISIS, with all the other realities as they are, exist today and do the same things? And my answer to that hypothetical question is a resounding yes. And here's why. Because when you look at violent extremism generally, not just ISIS, but globally, you find that groups conduct the same kind of violence and will justify it using the local social currency. That is sometimes Christianity, that is sometimes Judaism, that is sometimes Buddhism, and it is sometimes secular ideologies. So a world without Islam would still have a group like ISIS. They would just be called something else that's maybe less catchy. And I want to also point out something else. Forget globally. Let's look in terms of a timeline. In the same region, we had terrorism in the Middle East before there was a pronounced Islamic social currency. So there were secular terrorists, right, in the mid-1900s. They called themselves fid'ayin, or basically the sacrificers, those who would sacrifice for their cause. And they were secular Arab nationalists, mostly socialists, who conducted terrorist attacks, but under a very different ideology, because that was the social currency of the time. It was an Arab national social currency, so that's what they used. So my alternative explanation of the facts on the ground is this, just for all of you to consider, that it's not Islamic texts driving the violence, or it's not the interpretation of Islamic texts that is driving the brutality, but it's the desired brutality that is driving the interpretation of Islamic texts. We start at the violence we want to conduct, and we convince ourselves that this is the correct way to interpret the text. Now, as all of the panels have said, their views are, and I will very generously say, minority views. Another alternative way to look at it is there is a normative set of beliefs within Islam. Islam is not anything and everything, okay? It is a distinct set of beliefs, and there are some normative sets of beliefs which they, according to the vast majority of authorities on these normative beliefs, i.e. scholars, contradict these beliefs. There was a very important letter written and signed by hundreds of Islamic scholars sent to ISIS actually arguing for this. Like, hey guys, you got it wrong, from these authorities to the leadership of ISIS.
So I asked the panelists before we started, did they want to have questions from the crowd? And they really, really do want to hear from you all. So we have about 15 minutes. Please, right in the front.
I want to ask all of you, because I'm not that well educated about, only a little bit about what you're talking about and what I read about. And I've read Hirsi Ali's books. First, Infidel, and then I'm just finishing Heretic. Have any of you read Heretic?
Yeah, go ahead. Yeah.
So,
I can't
I've read
wait
all
to
of
hear.
it, but I've started it and also read the op-eds that have come out. But
Okay. Because she believes in a reformation. And I thought, I don't want to speak, I don't want to be inappropriate or disrespectful, but I love her books. And I love this book because it made sense.
Yeah, so I actually have major issues. I think actually her subtitle is wrong. Her subtitle in the book is Why Islam Needs a Reformation. I think she misunderstands both the Protestant Reformation and Islam and how both of those, but let me just, but in all seriousness, I mean, look, we can respect what she's trying to do, but we can say, well, is she making sense on this? And why do all societies and cultures and religions have to have a reformation? Islam isn't necessarily like Christianity. Christianity went through a particular process that ended up at this historical endpoint of liberal democracy. But what if the majority of Muslims, or the majority of Arabs in a particular area, decide that they don't want to be liberals, that they want Islam and Islamic law to play a central role in their lives? And this is where I might disagree a little bit with Maajid, that I don't think, so when we talk about Islamism, there's the Islamism of ISIS, but then there's the mainstream Islamism, and for me, Islamism just means people who want Sharia to play a prominent role in public life. And as long as you're calling for those things through a legal democratic process, we don't have to like it, but we have to respect that. And that's where I think groups like the Muslim Brotherhood or Ennahda in Tunisia are very different from groups like ISIS, even though they're all under the umbrella of Islamism, right? But I think we have to ask ourselves as Americans, why do Muslims, I mean, we're not, and this is where I don't like this language of we're all ultimately the same. What if we're not all the same? What if we want different things? And I think that calls into question this idea that we all end up with liberalism or a reformation or whatever it happens to be. And I think that's where Ayaan Hirsi Ali is maybe trying to push Muslims to be something which they don't necessarily want to be or have to be.
If I could just add one thing, I think the main issue is misdiagnosing the problem. And you misdiagnose the problem by analyzing the facts in isolation rather than looking historically and globally. So what Ayaan tends to do is find problems in Muslim societies and then attribute Islam to those problems and then comes up with a solution as we need to fix Islam. Whereas she ignores the socioeconomic, political drivers of many of those problems and ignores the facts that those exact same problems occur in other societies where Islam doesn't exist. So the idea of fixing Islam comes from a misdiagnosis of the problem in many cases by isolating that problem. The other danger of reforming Islam or this idea of let's make Islam whatever we want it to be is actually that's what the terrorists did. That's what ISIS did. Hey, we want to be able to enslave girls and have this many sex slaves. Let's make Islam so we can. So the idea of letting everyone do whatever they want with Islam doesn't necessarily mean you're going to get an outcome you like.
Great. Did you want to add anything, Graham?
Just to add to that point, I think it's clear that what ISIS is doing is itself a kind of reformation. There are interesting parallels between ISIS's program and the Reformation in Christianity. In both cases, you have a movement that devolves authority from scholars to ordinary people, that goes back to text in an incredibly scripturalist, literalist way. And finally, also that's accompanied by technological change. The internet in this case, the immediate availability of scholarly or amateur even text and interpretation to anyone who wants it. In the case of the Reformation, it was through print. Now, the internet.
Great, we have a question right here in green.
I wanted
yes,
to touch on
of
this.
course, yeah.
Sorry, apologies. I want to come out with a bit of a different perspective here, if that's okay.
Please.
I'm going to defend Ayaan from a position of disagreeing with her. I'm a Muslim. She's an ex-Muslim. If I agreed with her, I'd be an ex-Muslim. However, I think that it's, what we're losing here is that we're getting stuck in the meaning of the word Reformation. I don't think she literally wants to mimic the Christian Reformation. I think I've been in personal dialogue with her and Sam Harris. In fact, I'm releasing a book with Sam on this very topic, due to come out this October. And it's about whether it's possible indeed to address some of these questions from within the Islamic scriptural basis. I think all she really means is a small r reform of Islamic discourse. Now, if we're going to separate Islamism as I defined it and as I use it as the desire to impose a version of Islam over society. And yes, there are different types of Islamists. And I'm very happy with the progress that the Hizb al-Nahda have made in Tunisia. I think that's a wonderful example for the Muslim Brotherhood to copy. But if we're going to separate Islamism from conservative Islam as practiced in sort of social conservatism in the vast majority of Muslim majority societies, and then if we're going to ask the question that does conservative Islam need a small r reform to address some issues of misogyny, to address some issues of homophobia, of anti-Semitism and other issues, then I think the answer is very frankly yes. But that doesn't mean that we mimic the Reformation as it was historically. It just means we have to have an open conversation about some of the challenges of Islam coming to terms with modernity, as every other religion has gone through. Islam is 600 years older than Christianity. Christianity went through it, Reform Judaism exists, Judaism from the Old Testament literalist version has gone through it. You know, there is an issue among Muslim majority societies to address some of these questions. And I think really if we understand generously in that sense that that's what she's pushing for, her views have changed over the course of her books. Whereas she used to say Islam needs to be destroyed or obliterated, to now saying it needs a reform, that change in view needs to be from a Muslim voice. That should be encouraged and not dismissed because it's a positive step forward.
Great, thanks.
Check.
Great, thank you.
I have an opinion, and then I'm going to back it up, and then I'm going to ask you if you agree or disagree. I think the United States way overreacted to terrorist threats from 9/11 onwards specifically. And the reason that we're told is that it's about American lives. You know, we don't want to lose American lives. We lost 3,000 in 9/11. We've lost about 1.5 million in our wars since the Revolutionary War. That's about how many Americans have died. According to the American Medical Association, between 100 and 200,000 Americans die every year in our hospitals by mistakes, which means since 9/11, we've already lost more Americans than we had in all of our wars. That's why I think we've overreacted if we're really concerned about American lives. I'd love your all's opinions on that.
Why don't That's a deep question. Shadi,
Well, sure.
Why don't you answer that and we'll move on to another question
Okay,
as well.
so I don't actually think ISIS is really about us. And I feel like we're so American-centric. ISIS, unlike Al-Qaeda, is more focused on the Middle East. That's not to say that they wouldn't love it if they're, and that's happened, that there are people who are inspired by ISIS who commit attacks in the West. But ISIS as an organization is fundamentally focused on capturing and holding territory in the Middle East. So, but even if it's not 100% about us, it doesn't mean it shouldn't matter to Americans. Do we want an extremist, expansionist, neo-state in the middle of the Middle East? I would venture to say that the answer would be no. But I would also say that ISIS is not primarily a terrorist organization. That's not how I see them. And as Richard Haas said in the earlier session, they have this interest, unlike Al-Qaeda, in capturing territory and importantly, in governance. That's what makes ISIS so revolutionary and so distinctive as an organization. They actually are trying to do something, establish a caliphate, which no one really did before. Al-Qaeda would talk about the caliphate as an aspiration or an inspiration, but they didn't actually do it. That's where ISIS has set a new standard for extremist groups going forward, and that's why they should matter to us, because for the rest of our lives, whenever there's an ungoverned space, there's going to be that little extremist group that says, well, why don't we establish our own mini caliphate or mini emirate just like ISIS did?
So, I mean, Dali, I'd love you to just take this one step further. So you're talking about the underpinnings of this and the actual origins of this. Why now? In some of the criticisms of Graham's piece, people kept saying, well, why now? Why is this happening now? So I'm just wondering if you can help us with that.
You know, it's a difficult question. I'm not sure I know the answer, but some ideas of why now is Bashar al-Assad. That's, why now is he has massacred far more people than ISIS has, and when you have a situation of such brutal genocide that is completely ignored by the rest of the world, and a failed state basically in these two countries, you will see ugly things come out of that. In this case, it was ISIS, and it took on, again, the coloring and the veneer of its local currency, which was Islam. When you see ungovernable or ungoverned failed states in Africa, the brutality takes on, a different hue, a different ideology. So Why now? I think it's the product of the brutality of this war that we've ignored and allowed to continue.
Great. Yes, please.
Before that, I just wanted to hear more about the Muslim view of radical Islamism throughout the world that you did extensive interviews and research on. I'd like to hear more about that if I could.
Sure. Well, as actually my fellow panelists have mentioned, the polling that Gallup has done and other organizations has done showed that the vast majority of Muslims around the world condemn violent extremism, attacks on civilians. So you can actually access this report still on the Gallup site. It was done 10 years after 9/11, and it looked at global views of attacks on civilians. So it wasn't just Muslims, but it actually looked at 100 different countries. So it was people of all faiths. And what you find is that Muslims are at least as likely as people of other faiths to condemn attacks on civilians. But I think what's even more important is when you look at the ordinary people and you ask them, why do you condemn this act of violence? It's these people who actually bring up religion. It is people who are voicing an opposition to violence against civilians that are quoting from the Quran. And these are global studies that are representative. Those who condone the violence, the minority that say that they sympathize with it, they do not give religious justifications. They are actually giving political justifications for those views. So when you look at the issue empirically, what comes out is a picture where it is politics driving these issues and not a religion coming out, verses coming out of the Quran and mind controlling kids to go join ISIS.
Maajid, please.
My country, Britain, just lost roughly 30 people, among other nations, in the horrendous attacks that just occurred in Tunisia. And I want to mention, just to reinforce something Dalia just said, that there were Tunisian Muslim citizens who formed human rings around the tourists as they were being shot at, putting their bodies before the bullets. And they were shouting, Allahu Akbar, which is exactly what the terrorists shout when they want to kill civilians. They were shouting the same word, God is great, in attempting to put their own lives before the tourists that this terrorist was attempting to kill. So first of all, if I ever saw any of those Tunisian Muslims, I would embrace them as our brothers and sisters. And so Dalia is correct that that same faith has motivated people to profound acts of courage in the opposite direction. Now I want to say something where I have a slight disagreement with perhaps some of my co-panelists. And that is, however, we've got to understand something. I often worry that the bar has sunk so low when it comes to discussing Muslims. I call it the poverty of expectation. We're expecting Muslims to be so savage that we're delighted when we hear a Muslim say, I don't want to kill you. As if I deserve a thank you for saying I don't want to kill you. And that's what I call the poverty of expectation. Really, that should be the default baseline of a conversation anyway. The real question, what I'm really interested in, is not how many people support ISIS, because actually the majority of Muslims condemn ISIS. That still puts us in the same camp as, among others, among the majority of normative Muslims. It also puts us in the same camp as Al-Qaeda, as my former organization, Hizb ut-Tahrir, which is a revolutionary Islamist group, as many other types of Islamists, Jama'at al-Islamiyya, Islamic Jihad, they all condemn ISIS as well. So what I want to do is look a bit deeper as somebody who comes from within that community, who is desperately concerned with reforming some of the problematic aspects. And that is that I'm not just satisfied with us condemning the murder, but the attitudes beyond that. And they, when you take surveys in the United Kingdom, 33% of British Muslims say that they aspire to a notion of a theocratic caliphate. I find that troubling. Now, that doesn't mean they want the ISIS form of a caliphate, but we have to recognize that European Muslims, not American Muslims, there is a difference, but European born and raised Muslims are grappling with questions of identity and modernity and faith in a way which is troubling and needs to be addressed and openly spoken about. 33% for a caliphate is too many.
Thank you so much. Do you want to just respond quickly?
Really quick.
Thank you.
Maajid, I understand what you're saying, and I agree with you to a certain degree, but I think we also have to interpret how these polling questions are being understood by the respondents. One thing I want you to keep in mind is that in the United States, 55% of Americans say that they think the Bible should inform law, okay? 9% think it should be the only source of law. I still think we're a democracy. So the fact that people have, ideas about religion informing law does not make them terrorists or extremists.
Thank you so much, all of you, and your questions. And this is going to continue, clearly. Thank you, guys. Thank you very much. Thank you. That was amazing. It got more interesting at the end. You're incredible. I really hope.
Yeah. That was a little whatever.
Yeah, if only we got Reza Aslan up here.
Yeah, you need a little, that was a little whatever. That was, you were very good.
Thank you.
Yeah, very good. Yeah, that was good. You're very straight. I like the way, you do a very good job.
Thanks, appreciate it.
I'm not doing questions, am I? Okay, so 20 minutes? 20 minutes? Do I need, am I on? I'm on. I'm on. Hi, everyone. We're not finished yet. Can you hear me? Oh, that's excellent. Yeah. You're not on? Well, I'll just do all the talking then. That's fine. When you can get him on. Are we ready? Hi, everyone. I'm Jeff Goldberg from The Atlantic, and this is David Petraeus from the United States. We just we're going to wrap up this session by talking about specifically what can be done to combat terrorism. Yesterday, for those of you who were in the tent yesterday, we had a conversation about sort of the broad sweep of events in the Middle East. Today, we're going to focus it on ISIS. And actually, we're going to do this every day all summer up here. So you're all invited. Tomorrow, we're going to talk about...
He's going to do it all day.
Yeah, tomorrow, we're going to talk about modern dance, actually, which is fascinating. He knows a lot. So what you all know David Petraeus, obviously. He, not only as a director of the CIA, but before that as commander of CENTCOM, he had in his area of responsibility basically every problematic country from the American, almost every...
Except for North Korea.
Except for North Korea. They didn't give you that.
We were trying to get that.
Because you weren't busy enough.
Yeah.
And obviously among the countries you had were the places where ISIS has taken deepest root. And so let me, before we start about what can be done, I want to go back to this question that someone in the audience asked about overreaction and underreaction. And I always think of this, I've written about this before, it's the bathtub equation. More Americans have died in bathtub falls in the last 5 years than have died at the hands of terrorists. So why do we spend so much time, money, effort, and lives combating this threat? And it's rooted in an interesting it's an interesting observation. It's not, from my perspective, a question that fully understands the dynamic of terrorism. But why don't you go to that and answer this question from 2001 on? Do you think, looking back, have we spent a bit too much time being obsessed with a problem that isn't as serious as we think?
I mean, as a general proposition, not necessarily, but having said that, in fact, when I went up for the confirmation hearing to command the surge, I was asked, had we made any mistakes along the way, and I gave him about 4 or 5 pages of them. And I think that we should always ask a question, which was actually on the wall of the command post in the Great 101st Airborne Division when I was privileged to command it in the first year in Iraq. And the question asked, will this policy initiative or operation take more bad guys off the streets than it creates by its conduct? Question mark. And if the answer to that is no, then obviously you should go sit under a tree until the thought passes. And the fact is that when we fired the military without telling them what their future was, massive mistake. And it took us 5 long, bloody weeks until finally there was a grudging policy that we will pay them stipends for a while and so forth. But that was where we first started to create the seeds that were planted of the coming insurgency. And then to compound that, we take all down to level 4 in the Ba'ath Party and fire them without having an agreed reconciliation policy. Now, don't get me wrong, you had to do de-Baathification and you did have to do demobilization of the Iraqi military at some point, but you don't do it in a way that makes them all have an incentive for the new Iraq to fail rather than for it to succeed.
I want you to talk about American worries about this, because we're 14 years into this this worry. I mean, are we overreacting, not just to what's coming out of Iraq, but to the entire universe of Islamist extremism?
I don't think so at this moment. I think in some cases we need to do more, actually. Again, this doesn't mean you should do foolish stuff. You have to do it intelligently. It has to pass that test that I just laid out, and you have to have some real analysis behind that, and you have to understand the countries you're going to conduct operations in before you start them. Right. But having said that, I mean, this is a massive threat, not just to the region, which could engulf the entire Gulf region in a sectarian civil war, for goodness sake. I mean, the fact is that Syria already is a regional civil war, regional sectarian civil war being fought by proxies of the major countries in the region. Iranian proxy is the Bashar al-Assad regime and the Shia Lebanese Hezbollah and their Quds force. And on the other side, obviously, you have the Sunni Arab fighters, including, sadly now, an al-Qaeda affiliate and the Islamic State, which was so extreme that it was voted off the island by al-Qaeda.
Right. There's an interesting analog there in Gaza just in the last week. Hamas is complaining about ISIS coming into Gaza, and Hamas is complaining that they're too extreme, which it's an interesting state of affairs. But talk about so imagine
it's quite a standard, by the way.
Everything becomes more extreme. But you're talking to an audience of mainly Americans, and many Americans, polls have shown, are reporting themselves to be tired, quote unquote, even those Americans who didn't serve, tired of these wars.
Sure.
How do you relate?
Those who actually have fought them.
And you fought them. How do you explain why what happens in Syria, where Al Qaeda and Hezbollah are fighting it out? How do you explain to Americans why that matters? Because you believe that matters. Why does it matter to our national security?
Because it can unhinge the entire Middle East even more than it already has. What's really quite interesting is that the enormous instability in the Gulf region has actually not had a huge knock-on effect on global markets, which at the end of the day is something that we care about deeply. Right. The reason is, of course, because of the U.S. energy revolution and the increase in our own oil production of literally 4 million barrels per day over the last 4 years or so. We're up at 9.5 million barrels, the highest ever. That's more than offset what came off the market because of the violence in Libya, about 1 million barrels a day, the million barrels that came off because of sanctions in Iran, and then some other disruptions elsewhere. But the rest of the region is still exporting, and you might say, well, we don't care that much about it anymore because we don't consume as much of it as we used to. Very true, but that energy fuels our trading partners around the world, and if all of a sudden you had no freedom of navigation or a major disruption of one of the large nodes of, say, the Saudi energy system or something, you'll see a big knock-on effect in the global market. And that's at a time when the markets when the recoveries in some areas of the Eurozone are quite fragile. China's slowing down, India's not yet taking off, and so again, the only real serious driver of growth right now is the United States, and obviously, again, 7% growth in China is not to be laughed at, but it is slowing.
Richard Haas, earlier in this session, argued that ISIS and related threats are not defeatable. We have to manage this and contain it. Do you agree or disagree?
I'd do a little bit more than that. I think you have to do a bit more than just contain it. I mean, containing it means that they're allowed to control terrain from which presumably they'll do even more of what they already have been doing, which is attracting would-be jihadists and then sending them home, and also being seen as successful and recruiting more effectively in the internet because they are successful. Nothing succeeds like success.
What would you tell President Obama?
So,
they control thousands of square kilometers of Iraq and Syria right now. You're arguing that has to be rolled back.
It does, I think.
Is the current administration policy going to achieve that rollback?
The broad concepts, I think, are reasonable. the resources have to be amped up. And by the way, I think they will be. And by the way, I've offered this to various people in the administration, continue to ask, and same on Capitol Hill and the same in a variety of other places. I think if you want to get into specifics, for example, in Iraq, you have to have advisors not just at the division level, but at the brigade level of key Iraqi brigades that are in the fight. You do have to have joint tactical air controller teams available. I wouldn't put them forward unless I really needed to, because you're going to have very robust security so they don't end up in an orange jumpsuit in a cage somewhere. And that means you have to have combat search and rescue and a whole bunch of additional assets, even beyond what we have for the manned aircraft that are flying.
You're describing a nightmare for President Obama.
No, I'm not at all. You mark my words. You'll see a lot of this happen. The center of gravity, by the way, is in Baghdad. And what we have to do there is get a military organization with a 3-star at least in charge of it, who understands reconciliation with the Sunni Arabs, ideally was part of that process back in 2007, 2008, and can complement the efforts and work synergistically with the ambassador in the way that I was privileged to work with Ambassador Ryan Crocker. And every time you go to see the Prime Minister, even if it's the ambassador's meeting, the military commander's there. If it's my meeting, the ambassador was there. Sometimes we'd literally switch chairs just so it was very clear to the Prime Minister whose meeting it was at that point in time. But that's what has to happen. Now, we're not going to ever have the amount of influence that we had when we had 165,000 troops, and I have somewhat jokingly said that, I was the sheikh of the most powerful tribe in Iraq. That's not good. We're not going to repeat that, nor should we. In fact, we do need, however, a comprehensive civil-military campaign, we now meaning encompassing Iraq, that is very similar to what we did during the surge of ideas. There has to be a reconciliation component to bring the Sunni Arabs back into the fold, as we did then, and unfortunately as they were alienated afterwards. But the Iraqis have to do that this time with a little help from us. We can't do it. The way we did it last time is I sanctioned it. We did it in Anbar province, and then we brought the Baghdad government
I got to push back on something that you're suggesting a plan to ramp up, essentially training, advising, et cetera. But American leaders from Ash Carter, the Secretary of Defense, on down, just over the last period, have complained in pretty raw terms about the competence of the Iraqi army, the willingness of people to fight. Obviously, we've heard the same thing about what remains of the non-Islamist Syrian opposition. I mean, so give us your assessment of the Iraqi ability to actually do the things that you want our advisors to teach them to do.
Well, first of all, let me just say that I think you wait and see, but I think a lot of what I've just announced is discussed, I think will in some fashion play out. Second, I think it's very important to remember that once we got the Iraqi security forces reconstituted, because they got beat up very badly in the violence of 2006, it escalated so terrifyingly. Let's remember when we launched, the surge decision was made, there were 53 dead civilian bodies due to violence every 24 hours in the capital of Iraq alone, just in Baghdad. And I remember people would call over and say, when are you going to start seeing legislation in the parliament? I'd say, hey, these guys are just trying to survive until tomorrow. They can't get their kids to school, much less. So again, that was a very serious situation. But over time, the Iraqi security forces fought and died in much larger numbers than our forces, and we were able to hand off to them. And what happened?
Was Ash Carter wrong to say what he said?
I bet you, if you asked him, that he would probably use different words next time. For a U.S. Secretary of Defense, look, he's a brilliant guy. He has no bigger champion than me. He did stuff when I was a commander in Iraq, or in Central Command, Afghanistan, and frankly, when I was at CIA observing still, that was extraordinary. I called him one time when I was the Central Command commander. I said, hey, we just had the new mine-resistant, armor-protected vehicle, all-terrain version that we're going to use in Afghanistan. And drove it and so forth, and there's some shortcomings. I think you really have to get on before these are actually fielded. And lo and behold, he canceled his calendar the next day. He flew to Aberdeen Proving Ground in a helicopter, landed, drove it himself, experienced the same, there were some vision problems. These are serious in combat. And on the spot, issued 6 orders about transforming different pieces of this. And by God, they made them. That's great support. And he did this routinely when we were out there on a host of different issues. But I think in this case, to be as hard on your allies and partners. And also, to be fair, they did fight in Ramadi. They fought for 35 to 45 days, depending on the units. And when you get hit by 12 to 15 massive suicide car bombs, there aren't too many forces that are going to stand up against that. And by the way, if you look at the number of sorties that actually dropped that day, that's not particularly impressive on our part. If they're really engaged as they were, we have to go back. We have to do a real post-mortem on that Battle of Ramadi and ask why we couldn't bring our assets to bear more effectively, and what can we do to help the situation in the future.
Come back to this. I want to come to the threat, the domestic terror threat in a second, but let me stay with this, because listening to you sort of between the lines, it sounds as if you believe that the Obama administration is not pursuing this campaign against ISIS with as much alacrity as it could. Is that a fair statement?
I think that, again, the level of the overall concepts broadly, I think are correct. I think the description of the threat that the president gave back last fall when he did his first speech on this, spot on. I think the strategy is a good departure point. I think, again, that more resources do need to be applied in various places, and I think that in some cases we waited too long to get on with certain aspects of, say, in Syria.
You were close in. What is the president's hesitancy, do you think?
Well, to be fair, these are tough questions, and there have been recommendations made over the years with respect to, say, what we might do in Syria, and there's nobody, starting with me, who could say, if you do this, I guarantee you that your policy objective is going to be achieved. And there are other people saying, there were analysts that were saying, my own analysts said, well, I'm not sure this is going to make as big a difference as you do. So these are not easy issues, and in some cases, you know, that he who hesitates wins, but sometimes he who hesitates loses.
Let me ask you the same question that I've asked President Obama, a lot of other people have asked President Obama, which is that if you could roll the clock back to 2011, 2012, would you have gone all in to support the Syrian opposition when it wasn't dominated by Islamists? In other words, when I asked the president that, and when other people asked, he said, look, this opposition, I'm paraphrasing now, but this opposition was never going to win. It was a bunch of carpenters, dentists, farmers. You know the line very well. Was it a mistake not to go in and support?
Yeah, without talking about what I might have recommended at the time, because if I had, I would have been the CIA director, and it would have been covert action and so forth. But there was no Jabhat al-Nusra al-Qaeda affiliate at that time. There was no Islamic State. You didn't have Lebanese Hezbollah in on Bashar al-Assad's side, nor the Quds Force. It was basically about helping, and there were reasonably moderate Sunni Arabs at the time, and had we helped them, I certainly don't think we could be in a worse situation than we are now. I mean, that I will absolutely guarantee. I think it's very difficult to look back and say that we could have taken action that would have actually brought us to a worse situation than we are now, with 250,000 Syrians dead, an al-Qaeda affiliate alive, Islamic State owning a third of each country, and having revenue producing. But we are taking a toll on the Islamic State. I don't think people that don't watch this closely enough don't realize how much damage we are doing to them over time. And again, I do think we have to roll it back. I think Iraq is doable, by the way, and those people who sort of blithely say, well, let it break up into Sunnistan, Shiistan, and Kurdistan, I think owe the rest of us an explanation of how you get to that point, who draws the lines on the boundary, and how this is going to be an amicable divorce rather than an extraordinarily violent event akin to that which is taking place in Syria.
Right. Let me ask you about the domestic news. There's been a 4th of July terror threat. It's one of these vague, ambiguous, yet because they're vague and ambiguous, utterly frightening kind of warnings out of various government agencies that there is a heightened state of alert. Obviously, we're coming off a week and a half in which you had the attack in France, you had the attack in Tunisia, Kuwait, so on, Kobani. How worried should we be that elements of these groups, or lone wolves inspired by these groups, are pivoting to moving their attention to us and moving their attention to attacks in the homeland?
Well, I think they have been trying to do that. I think they have been successful in inspiring, at the very least, some of these attacks that have taken place in our homeland, none of which has materialized into something truly horrific. But the prospect, again, of the ability in our country to go to a gun show and without any background check whatsoever, to buy a weapon that is, akin to what our soldiers carry in combat, with a higher capacity magazine, and plenty of ammo, and to take these into the Mall of the Americas or some densely populated place and open fire, I'm stunned that it hasn't happened already. And at some point, this is going to inspire someone to take that kind of action. And there's lots of other scenarios that could be even worse.
Let me give you let me just break this down as a final question. Are you more worried about, let me phrase it this way. Do Al-Qaeda or any of its affiliates, or ISIS or any of its affiliates, have the capability now? I'm assuming they have the desire, but do they have the capability of staging anything on the order of 9/11?
I don't think so. I think, again, that the planning for that was carried out by individuals, of course, on Afghan soil at a time when the Taliban controlled Afghan and allowed them to be there, Al-Qaeda, and Al-Qaeda senior leadership, where they were not worried about stuff falling out of the sky on top of them. And had some very sophisticated planners and apparatus and all the rest of that. And before, we'd broken down some of these stovepipes in the intelligence community and law enforcement communities, gotten big data analytics going, gotten a lot more authorities to carry out various items of surveillance overseas and at home. So I think the situation is very different now. But I'm sure that there are people out there trying to think up something that's very diabolical and completely different.
So if the lone wolves, the ones inspired by the internet jihad, if you will, are the thing that might keep you up more than, let's say, a massive, well-organized Al-Qaeda attack, what would you do to break that cycle? What would you recommend the United States government do to break the cycle of internet quick self-radicalization?
I think it's what we are doing, and we have joint counterterrorism task forces around the country, particularly great ones in some of the big cities. I visited a number of these when I was a director of the CIA. We had individuals embedded in them, but it's FBI, it's all the local law enforcement. You have very good ties into a variety of different forms of surveillance out there. Domestic sources, again, carried out by domestic law enforcement, not by our intelligence agencies in that regard. And again, fusing all of this and bringing to bear increasingly effective analytical tools, Palantir and so forth, that kind of big data, very powerful, and now enabled by cloud computing with much higher computation power and scalable storage that can accommodate all the big data that we're putting into it.
Let me just focus this for our final question. The reports that I'm seeing, the reports that you're seeing, suggest that there is this amorphous but imminent threat in the homeland. People have used the word imminent in the last couple of days. You've been watching this and doing this for 14 years and much longer, in fact. And I want you I don't want you to provide solace or comfort where you don't feel it, but give us in the historical continuum from pre 9/11 to now. Where do you think we stand in terms of threats to American targets on American soil?
I think, again, this has been a bit of a sine wave. I think it's gone up a bit because of the advent of the Islamic State in particular, at a time when we have been making considerable progress against Al-Qaeda. The most dangerous job in the world over the last 4 years is the deputy head of Al-Qaeda. And, 4 of them have
they should just have number 3s. They shouldn't appoint anybody number 2, right?
You don't want to be the number 2 in Al-Qaeda.
Right.
Yeah. So we've made progress against the leadership of Al-Qaeda. There's a hugely diabolical bomb maker in Yemen who still has to be brought to justice. But you see this new group arising. It's successful. It's very active in cyberspace and very skilled in that arena. You read about this horrifying case of the recruitment of the individual, very prominent recently. So this is a big threat to our country and to our allies and partners. They have experienced this on their soil. It was mentioned earlier, the British citizens that were killed, 36 or so, give or take, in Tunisia on the beach. This is a big deal.
General, thank you very much for
My
talking
pleasure.
to us. Thank you very much for coming to this session. Thank you.